Good evening. My name is Marcel Wilson. I'm the site manager here at the Youngstown Historical Center of Industry and Labor, also known as the Steel Museum. As you may know, we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year and are featuring a speaker series with the presentations tonight and two more, one in September and one in November. We hope you'll return for both of those too. Tonight, Dr. Tom Leary discusses saving steel history. Dr. Leary will look at other industrial preservation efforts contemporary with the campaign that resulted in the establishment of the museum. Recently retired from YSU, Dr. Leary and his firm, Industrial Research Associates, consulted on many of these projects. He will outline the scope of documentation and organizational efforts in Buffalo, Joliet, Illinois, Johnstown, and Pittsburgh, among other locations. Illustrations for his talk will include recently digitized 35mm slides showing the historic equipment and environments that represented an important aspect of American history, as well as a challenge to conventional museum practice. In that context, the creation of the Steel Memorial in Youngstown stands as a significant accomplishment. Dr. Leary is the author of From Fire to Rust, Business Technology and Work at the Lackawanna Steel Plant, 1899 to 1983, and the compiler of an annotated bibliography, Iron and Steel Sites in Allegheny County with Elizabeth C. Schultz. He currently serves as an advisor at the museum. Please help me welcome Dr. Tom Leary.
Thank you, Marcel. Pleasure to see you all here in our continuing lecture series. And I hope that, again, we'll be able to provide some larger context for the 30th anniversary event that we're celebrating in terms of the museum's continuing operations. So my responsibility tonight is to give you a look at what else was going on in terms of issues surrounding steel history and the preservation of that history at the time that this museum was coming into focus as part of the Ohio Historical Society. So there is in the federal government an agency that pays particular attention to the documentation of historic resources related to engineering and industrial sites. It's known as the Historic American Engineering Record. It's part of the National Park Service, was established in 1969, and is a counterpart to a similar agency, the Historic American Building Survey, which has been documenting domestic structures and other examples of American architecture since it was established in 1933. So the results of projects conducted by both these agencies is available in the Library of Congress. You can look at HABS/HAER/HALS, which is Historic American Landscape Survey, to get an inventory of sites across the nation. So what sorts of things would this collection contain? Well, since one of the founding agencies of the Historic American Building Survey was the American Society of Civil Engineers, there's a great deal about applications of civil engineering principles in structures such as bridges. This is an example in western New York State, over the Genesee River in Letchworth State Park. It was at that time the third bridge on that site, the earliest dating back to 1852, is no longer extant now, was replaced, as I understand it, 4 or 5 years ago by a steel arch bridge. But certainly an example of the type of structures that the Historic American Building Survey would be interested in. Lighthouses, aids to navigation on the Great Lakes. This is an octagonal stone lighthouse at the outlet of the Niagara River into Lake Erie. Railroad transportation structures. So we would be standing now in the center of what's known as the Montezuma Swamp, which is an area of unstable ground between Syracuse and Rochester, on what was once the main line of the New York Central Railroad. And the question was, how do you support railroad track in a swamp? And the solution that was basically found was to use the same sort of rafting principles that were later used for the foundations of tall buildings in Chicago to create not a structure that rested on bedrock, but a kind of timber raft that distributed the load over such an area that the structure above it was stable. Other aspects of the application of steam to railroading, historic locomotives. This was an excursion line in Wyoming County with a steam engine from the famous Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. Examples of production practices. This is at the Steuben Crystal Works of the Corning Glass Company, and involved the hand blowing according to techniques that continued until relatively recently to show the types of skills and labor that the process of industrialization in the 19th and 20th century both extinguished in some cases and created a new demand for in others. Application of steam to the generation of electricity. This is a powerhouse in Lockport, New York, with a stationary steam engine on the left and an electric generator on the right. So prior to the development of an interlocked grid, many early industrial sites generated their own power and transitioned from using steam or water power to operate their machinery to generating their own electricity in order to do so. And it was the job of eager young people to go out into the field and record these various structures. So that was basically what I was doing. I was hired in 1976 to work for the Historic American Engineering Record, which was then attempting to construct a national inventory. They never made it, but they did commission a number of regional and state level studies that filled in a number of the gaps. People that I knew when I was in graduate school at this time in New England were working on historic American engineering record inventories in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Gave me an idea of what that sort of work was like. I had an interest in being in Western New York at that particular time. And we were able to put together a package to conduct a similar survey at that particular time. It lasted about a year, longer than was anticipated. This was 1976 and 1977. So without doing the math, I was considerably younger then, but managed to get through what were some rather difficult working conditions for doing a field inventory. So I was working out of Rochester and had an appointment one day to go to Buffalo to look at a particular site. So I called them up and said, I think it would be a good idea for me to try to drive to Buffalo today. And since what was on the horizon was the blizzard of 1977. It turned out that it would not have been a good day to drive to Buffalo, and they did not have to talk to me too long to convince me that what I was looking for would still be there after the snows eventually melted in the spring. But one thing that did happen on that inventory, so as you've seen, historic American engineering record projects involve a number of different sites and a number of different technologies. In Western New York, particularly in the Buffalo area, the steel industry at that time was still very significantly present, particularly in the form of Bethlehem Steel's plant in Lackawanna, New York. Yeah. I had no experience with steel up until that time in New England. I had been principally involved with the history of the textile industry and the machine shops that built the equipment for that particular part of American industrialization. But I soon found that the steel sites that I encountered in the course of this inventory became something that I wanted to know more about, because the production process and the jobs that were involved and its relationship to the overall history of American industrialization were something that I found not only interesting, but visually quite compelling. So back to New England, picked up my old job at the Slater Mill Historic Site. And there are not a lot of steel mills in New England, but there was one in Rhode Island, as it turned out. And because the Slater Mill Historic Site was also a site where there had been early rolling and slitting mills, we were able to rationalize a project that was relatively far from our traditional mission, but one that fit in. And that had to do with a place called Washburn Wire. So at Washburn Wire, we saw basically a production technique from 1907 that was unchanged 70 years later in terms of a heating furnace and a series of rolling mills that reduced an ingot while it changed its shape, all the time being passed from stand to stand and caught by hand with tongs. So we're looking at the roughing mill here in the foreground, 3-high mill, and a looping train in the back where you can see that the steel is now assumed a form where to shift from one stand to another, the catcher loops the hot steel around themselves, like this. And because the loops basically represent a technology where the adjustment of the speed of the rolls does not have to be exact enough to take up the elongation that takes place from stand to stand. It can basically loop out onto the floor and then be taken up. But still, there's an increase in the speed as the bar moves from stand to stand. So when we get to the finish catcher here, the last stand of the looping train, this is basically moving at several hundred feet per second. So he's standing here with his tongs, the rolls are here. It's going to spit out something moving at several hundred feet per second. And his job basically is to try to catch it as close to the end of the bar as possible, because the more of the bar that's on the other side of the tongs, the harder it's going to be to manipulate.
They couldn't design a machine to do that? It had to be done by a person?
Well, this particular technology in the niche that they occupied was still economical. Now, you can devise a continuous mill where you don't need looping at all. That's what many modern bar mills do. But sometimes they have more difficulty rolling odd shapes, asymmetric shapes, for example. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But that's the way it's supposed to work. Doesn't always work that way, in which case your product sometimes winds up on the.
You got a copy.
That's a comment. So when we were in this mill, and we were basically in the mill because it had closed down, reopened under new ownership. The new ownership was not willing to continue the union contract that the steelworkers had formerly had. So the president of that union wound up as a bartender in my favorite bar. So I asked him one day, John, do you think you can get people with cameras into that mill so that we could film? He said, I think we can, and they did. So to John O'Neill, we basically owe the fact that we were able to take these slides, even though I'm sure nowadays liability lawyers would be horrified that anyone would be allowed not only inside the building, let alone while it was still running. Anyway, the crew was looking out for us. So they said, well, where you're taking pictures from might not really be safe. You need to go someplace, stand someplace else. So where we were supposed to go stand to be safer was there. Fortunately, we were a little slow. So having wet my whistle in that particular study, which eventually wound up being published, I then took another job at the Historical Society in Buffalo, where plants, as they were in this area, in the iron industry, steel industry, auto plants were shutting down in the early 80s. And the Historical Society at that time had, I think, a very progressive vision of its mission. They realized the past is no longer a log cabin. The past is a steel mill. And we, the Buffalo Historical Society, need not only to prepare our institution to deal with what is now the new past, but also to be able to build collections in areas that no one had ever thought would be the responsibility of a historical society. Who's going to pick up tongs from a rolling mill when you're basically used to dealing largely with artifacts from life in a handicraft era? Well, one way to engage in preservation is through documentation. So we struck a deal with the Historic American Engineering Record to send their chief photographer to Buffalo to photograph the Lackawanna Works before demolition actually began. So this is Jet Lowe. He's the chief photographer of the Historic American Engineering Record. He is used to dealing with photographic requirements in odd places. He climbed to the top of the Statue of Liberty when it was being refurbished in 1986. He's taken his camera to the top of the towers on the Golden Gate Bridge. So being 100 feet in the air, standing on a railing over a ship canal in Buffalo, New York, was no big deal. It was a slightly bigger deal for my wife, whose responsibility basically was to keep his camera out of the canal. What isn't shown is that here are 2 lanes of traffic. So while the relationship between historical documentation agencies and corporate owners of property with historical value is now smooth. We were very lucky in Buffalo. The individual who Bethlehem Steel put in charge of the demolition of the Lackawanna plant was very sympathetic to this notion of trying to document as much as we could beforehand. So we were able to get relatively unrestricted access to all the parts of the plant that we were able to show through research were historically significant in terms of representing typical or unusual aspects of the entire range of steelmaking process, everything from the blast furnaces through steelmaking to rolling mills and other facilities. But we were also able to do something else. We were able to convince the people in Washington that in addition to looking at properties which were facing shutdown and extinction, they should also try to document ongoing active processes in the sense that they would then have a record of what these particular operations were like in everyday activity. And so, partly because of contacts that we had with the union that represented workers at companies like American Brass, here, we were able to document ongoing operations. This is the furnace that basically casts brass and copper for various applications. As it turned out, the chief caster on this furnace was my neighbor and was able to tell us in great detail what was involved in the work that he basically did every day, which was invisible to the community of Buffalo up to that point. No one knew that there was such a plant, that people did such work, but it was still an important part of an economy where the steel industry was largely vanishing from the scene. So eventually we were able to put up a couple of exhibits. This is the Buffalo Leary County Historical Society, essentially a 1901 marble palace, not the easiest place to put up exhibits about industrial America. But we were able on one level to put up our documentation from Lackawanna, and on the other, lower level, to work with a photographer by the name of David Plowden, who was at that time also very, very well known for his documentation of steel mills and other industrial sites. And I'm proud enough to say that we were the only institution, I think, in America that had ever had an exhibit simultaneously by these two major photographers at the same time. The exhibit itself brought us in contact with people whose workplaces we were photographing. So, called up the media, said, well, we're going to be doing this big project with the National Park Service. How about a story to tell people this is what the Historical Society is doing? Would you be interested in talking about the work that you once did at Bethlehem Steel or similar places like that? So the article went out, very good article, and I sat in my office waiting for the phone to ring. How many times did it ring? Once. But the guy was a jack. What he called up and what we eventually wound up talking about was what's in this case here. He was the boss roller in the railway, and he had kept a daily diary of everything that he did at work since from 1942 when he was hired on until 1977 when Bethlehem shut down the rail mill at Lackawanna. And he was more than willing to talk to us about what the process of rolling rails involved, who was on the crew, what the metallurgical issues are. If you have a rig, like a tier. You've got something with a blob of metal at the head, got a skinny little web, and then you've got little itty feet. When you roll a shape like that, the temperatures change unequally. So you have to be able to compensate for this through control of the cooling rate, and you also have to be able to design passes in the rolls that are going to reduce the size and shape of the initial billet of steel that you're working with in a way that will allow the finished product to come out uniformly metallurgically throughout an entire heat. So that's what the fellow who used tools like this, these are feeler gauges. And this is what you use to determine how far apart rolls are. So for a certain type of rail, you want a certain distance. And these are the tools that he used in order to be able to set the distance of the rolls at the specifications that were required. And the captions for most of the photographs turned out to be excerpts from the oral interviews, basically, that we did, so that people found that those who were unfamiliar with these industrial processes got an introduction to them from the people who had spent their lives doing that particular kind of work.
Doctor, what's your definition for a steel mill compared to mills? There's a certain definition. I really didn't know what it was till I looked it up, and it's pretty specific.
Well, an integrated steel mill basically would start with raw materials and
Right, yeah.
finished products. You can have
Well, making iron and then making steel. And then beyond that, that's the fabricating side. Like there was fabricating plants in Youngstown that took the steel from the integrated steel mills and made their own products.
right. So that would be
commercial shearing and stamping.
That would be, in a sense, something outside what I'm talking about now. So
yeah.
The Pollock Company, for example, manufactures the ladle cutters. That would be part of the manufacturing industry whose products went into the steel mills.
Right, or was made from.
But steel basically is initially, when you're transforming iron ore into pig iron, it's basically a reduction process. You're taking oxygen out of it. Making steel, you're basically using oxygen in combination with other elements to create a new.
Right, that's what it means, you know. So sometimes when people say steel mill, they think of somebody that made products, but really it's steel mill means one that took it from the raw materials.
So what we'll be talking about here mostly will basically end with what comes off rolling mills and goes to the loading dock.
Yeah, that's a rolling mill. Yeah.
So documentation, photographically, oral interviews, is one method of preservation. There was also a question about whether it would be possible to preserve physical examples of the sites and machinery that could illustrate the development of the history of the steel industry. One place where this became a focal effort was Johnstown, Pennsylvania. So in Johnstown, The steel industry went back to, the iron and steel industry went back to the mid-19th century with the establishment of the Cambria Iron Works that later became another part of Bethlehem Steel. So Bethlehem Steel's vision of where Johnstown basically fit in the overall array of its assets was largely bound up with the facilities that were in place there, what they could make, particularly what types of mills they had, and what industries those particular mills were able to service. In the National Park Service, there was an individual who was then working at Hollidaysburg, which was one of the communities around the Allegheny Ridge in Pennsylvania, both sides of the summit of that particular east-west crossing in Pennsylvania. And what this individual in Hollidaysburg, a guy by the name of Randy Cooley, came up with was an idea that the National Park Service should develop a facility that would interpret the history of the coal, railroading, and iron industries of the Allegheny Ridge as a new focal point for a national park. And he went about trying to sell this idea to a local congressional representative who was a man by the name of John Murtha. John Murtha at that time, decorated Vietnam veteran, relatively new in his job at the time that this idea of a national park in his district gets floated. But he likes the idea because he thinks heritage tourism or people coming to an area to see a place that is different from the place in which they live could be a new source of economic activity for his district. So he begins to talk to the National Park Service about whether they would be interested in such a project. And if so, could it be in Johnstown? Well, Park Service's first question usually is, what are the resources? What's there? And particularly, since they are the National Park Service, what is there that is of national significance? Well, part of the steel industry in Johnstown, these are the Gautier mills. They were very much like the process that we saw of looping and otherwise handling material by hand in rolling mills. And that was, again, largely unchanged. So here's a possibility for people to see the past at work, because this is still an ongoing business. So it's not as if the Park Service would necessarily have to set up as its own expense something that is still actively in operation. So a local museum, then the Johnstown Flood Museum, now the Johnstown Area Heritage Association, under Richard Berker, who was its leader at that time, began collecting small to medium-sized examples of steelmaking technology. Again, this is a roll stand, and the shape that the roll is going to produce is determined by the shape of the roll between which the piece of steel will pass. So the Park Service came into Johnstown, headed by a Park Service historian by the name of Sharon Brown, and they surveyed the resources, what's there. And what they found was an octagonal masonry blacksmith shop dating from 1854, still in use. But what they also found was that demolition was underway. So here in Johnstown, the blast furnaces were already down. The stoves. So what we're looking at here are basically the stoves that heated the blast, not the blast furnace itself. But Randy Cooley talked to Bethlehem Steel and with John Murtha, who had a very significant congressional position. He was on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, which is a very good position for horse trading, because oftentimes a bill that goes through that committee can benefit a particular member's district, who in return would be willing to vote for legislation that would benefit something in John Murphy's district. Tim Ryan is figuring out exactly the same sort of thing right now. He is also on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee and has a proposal for a steel heritage area in Youngstown, North End. So what Johnstown would have to offer basically would be an opportunity for tourists to follow Bethlehem Steel's active operations, see how they made ingots. So what we're looking at, these are basically steel ingots out of an electric arc furnace. And then see how they were placed in soaking pits in order to equalize their internal and external temperature, and follow them through a series of rolling mills. This was Randy Cooley's plan to collaborate with Bethlehem Steel to make their continuing operations in Johnstown accessible to the public as the centerpiece of 1/3 of what they were calling America's Industrial Heritage Project. So America's Industrial Heritage Project would involve the Park Service in interpreting resources and sites related to steel, related to the railroad industry. This is basically where you have the famous horseshoe curve in order to be able to get trains over the Allegheny Mountains. And coal mining as well. Did it work? No, did not. Although basically what happened was the Park Service did not like being told by politicians what it should do, regardless of whether it came with a check or not. So the Park Service more or less sat on its hands in terms of the types of studies that would have needed to be done in order to lay the groundwork for the designation of Cambria Iron Works as a National Park Service site. At the same time as this initial effort to try to involve the Park Service in the preservation of steel heritage in Johnstown, a completely different kind of operation is taking place in Illinois. And this involves classical archaeology, excavation in order to find the remains of former sites which have now vanished. So outside Joliet was one of 11 sites where the Bessemer steelmaking process was initially installed. The Bessemer process required a patent pool. There were inventors who had patent control over the scientific principles, other inventors who had control over the necessary machinery, other inventors, particularly a British engineer by the name of Robert Machette, who was able to control the amount of recarburization in Bessemer steelmaking. This was key. Otherwise, you basically just line up for iron. But Machette basically had an amalgam of ingredients, which he called Spiegeleisen, that were added to the bath after all the carbon had basically been blown out of it, that brought the carbon level up to the level required for steelmaking. So all these patents were required in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War in order to establish a Bessemer plant any place in America. And eventually 11 places were selected, of which Joliet was one. So in terms of national significance, that might be enough to interest the Park Service. The remains, however, were above ground, relatively unimpressive. Some stone columns and foundations, but eventually by actual archaeological excavation, the bases of a number of the pieces of equipment that were used in this early Bessemer plant were exposed by this fellow, Jack Bergstresser, and seized on by this fellow, Jerry Edelman, who was figuring out a way to get a number of different agencies in the Chicago area to sign on to this particular site as a National Steel Heritage Attraction. Within 6 or 7 years, and with relatively low levels of expenditure, they were able to do so by adopting or merging steel history with the recreational opportunities of the bike path. So, linking the various excavated sites with interpretive signage, we now have an alternative to constructing an indoor museum in order to interpret the history of the past. So merging recreation, active recreation, with historical interpretation was one of the major initiatives that took place here in Joliet under the stewardship of the Will County Forest Preserve. Now, by this time, of course, my wife and I were in the consulting business, and we were looking for work, and we would have loved to have had a contract to write the text for this interpretive trail. But as it turned out, this was something that under Jerry Edelman was able to overcome what is often a difficult situation when multiple agencies are involved in planning and administering a historic site. Visions may differ, but in this instance, they were able to find ways to work together, and within a relatively short time at relatively low expense, had something that, with planning for the kinds of greenways that are now being discussed in this area, could very well add to the kind of visitor experiences about the history of the steel industry that we experience with indoor interpretive exhibits such as this museum, and go on to extend that story out into the landscape as well. Pittsburgh. So, word gets down to Pittsburgh. Hey, these people in Johnstown are going to be the steel capital of America. Reaction?
Not happening.
Not on my watch. So, one of the key sites is this former pump house at the Homestead Steelworks. The site, if any of you ever took any courses in the history of American labor, know that this was the site of an epic confrontation between the steel company owned by Andrew Carnegie and managed by Henry Clay Frick, and one of the important labor organizations of the period, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, which ultimately wound up as a gun battle. So this pump house was in two sites. Part that we're looking at here was present in 1892. Other side of the wall added in 1898, but it was subsequently revised as a facility for public events. So you can go to events at the pump house now as part of something called the Rivers of Steel National Heritage Area. Long time. What does it mean? Basically means that a heritage area involves some degree of National Park Service involvement, but not as much as something that would be called a national park. So heritage areas were basically devised because there were so many demands being made on the Park Service, not just for new sites related to industrial history and the aftermath of deindustrialization, but other topics as well, that it was clear that the Park Service was not going to be able to own, manage, and develop all of them. So this sort of halfway house of the heritage area was devised in 1986 in order to provide some degree of federal input and control, but nothing to the extent that would involve full Park Service ownership, such as had occurred in Lowell, Massachusetts. So, 1978, the first Park Service site in an urban area. We think of the Park Service basically as, hey, like they're out in the woods. But the Park Service is the federal government's premier agency for historic preservation as well, has been increasingly since the Park Service's role had expanded with the assumption of responsibility for the care of battlefields and other physical sites. So, since the Park Service first designated Lowell, Massachusetts as its first urban and essentially industrial park, the next question obviously was, well, what else are they going to do? And particularly, where is the National Park for Steel going to be? Johnstown, Pittsburgh, someplace else. Also in Homestead, this is the Boast building. This was the BOST, the Boast building. This is on 8th Avenue, if any of you are familiar with Homestead. This was the headquarters on the top floor of the union, the Amalgamated Association that was leading the strike. And on the lower floors was basically the headquarters for the various media agencies that were covering the strike. So Homestead had some physical resources related to its labor history, had some physical survivals related to the influence of the steel industry on the community. This industrial school named for Charles Schwab later president of Bethlehem Steel. At that time, one of Andrew Carnegie's employees as well. So there were some buildings such as that could be resources in a steel national heritage park. What there wasn't was a steelworks. So basically, U.S. Steel, in terms of its demolition plan for the Homestead Works, was not able to achieve any sort of modus vivendi with those who were interested in developing some sort of historical attraction related to the National Park Service as a strategy both for community commemoration and regeneration. So some markers went up around the pump house. But the question was, what would need to be found in order to be able to document a story of national significance? Well, at this point, we, which is to say my wife and I, at our firm got hired, and we were given the mission to see what we could come up with in terms of things that the National Park Service and groups supporting a steel museum in Homestead could make use of. So this is a charging machine for an open hearth furnace. It was basically designed to allow bathtub-sized loads of scrap to be mechanically inserted into a furnace. So there's a mechanical arm that extends out toward the furnace, which would be out of the picture on your left, grabs the bathtub full of scrap, shoves it into the furnace, inverts it, reverts it, moves on to the next one. This is one of the machines that allow the open hearth furnace to scale up its productive capacities and surpass the original Bessemer process, which was generally, although a very fast process, limited to much smaller heat sizes. And so mechanization of the handling of scrap and charging the furnace was an important factor in the eventual supremacy of the open hearth in the first half of the 20th century. So we told the Steel Heritage Group in Pittsburgh, get that machine. Didn't. This is the gear train on a steam engine driven 48-inch universal plate mill, which we also found. Very distinguished gentleman from the Smithsonian by the name of Robert Vogel also found this. And, well, he was Robert Vogel. But we were the ones who found the article in the Iron Age magazine that described this mill and told what it was like when it was installed.
Was that made by Mesta or Blanox, or do you know the name?
That particular mill, I think, was Mesta, but I'd have to go back and check my notes. So there were a wide variety of other companies that were still active in one way or another in the Pittsburgh area. One example, the Lockhart Company in McKees Rocks, the last company in America to make wrought iron by the Putling process in 1957. And curiously enough, before the company ended that particular phase of its operations, they filmed it, or actually had U.S. Steel film. And when I was calling around working on the history of this area in terms of whether it could be a national park or not. I called up Locke and I said, well, you guys were the last place to call. And he said, yeah, you want a copy of the film? So I have that. We were able to incorporate it in a video in one of the spring classes. So I'm sure if you want to see a video of Iron Public, which no one does in America anymore, and hear a verbal description of it read over the video by myself. I'm sure Jacob can tell you how to access that. Other examples of the presence of the steel industry still in the landscape. Everyone knew about the large scale companies. U.S. Steel's Edgar Thompson Works, which is still in business. The Duquesne plant, National Tube plant, Homestead plant. But there were a lot of small and medium-sized companies that had often started out making steel by the crucible process that later essentially became tool steel companies. This is Black Diamond Works. The bridge is the 31st Street Bridge on the Allegheny River. This is now a movie studio. They actually shoot films there because the large open expanses of industrial spaces turned out to lend themselves to purposes for which they had never been envisioned. Many other examples as part of Pittsburgh's industrial history. Crescent Steel, looking toward downtown. The Dover Porter Company, this is on the south side. The Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation was accumulating large industrial artifacts. This is the Bessemer converter that was never used to make steel. So there was a company called AM Buyers that made wrought iron pipe. And they used their Bessemer converter in their plant up at Ambridge, essentially to make wrought iron and didn't recarburize it. So we have an example of a Bessemer converter. We just don't have one that was ever used in terms of the steelmaking process. But its operations were essentially the same. So the Rivers of Steel National Heritage Area largely focuses today on two blast furnaces on the Monongahela River in Rankin. These are the former Cary furnaces, Cary 6 and 7. This is the cast house for Cary 6. You're basically looking at the point where iron would be tapped from the furnace, diverted into various channels perpendicular to it. This is the basis for pig iron, the term. The idea supposedly of a long channel stemming from the furnace with shorter channels intersecting it at 90-degree angles. In an agricultural environment, it reminded someone of sow nursing piglets, hence the metal that congealed there was called pig iron. Well, that's one story. But Rivers of Steel had a particular political strategy. They figured the more political support we can get by including sites in the districts of people outside the immediate Pittsburgh area, the stronger we will be in our contest with John Bertha and Johnstown to see who the Park Service is going to be designated. So geographical expansion does not necessarily lead, however, to a coherent visitor experience. This is Shove. This is a beehive cocoa. This is a technique for producing from metallurgical coal the fuel that is used to smelt iron in a blast furnace. Coke. Beehive coke. Shove was the last beehive oven to actually operate as of 1972, man by the name of Max Noble. Continued to attempt to comply with EPA requirements in terms of the discharges from some ovens, such as this, in order to try to provide this particular type of coke, which had certain advantages for certain uses compared to the byproduct coke, which had replaced it particularly during the First World War. So rather than venting byproducts into the atmosphere, they were now captured and refined in large plants such as U.S. Steel's facility at Clare. This is one of the
sheet 2 Struthers works. That worked.
So you might perhaps be able to tell our audience something about that when we're done.
Well, the byproducts plant was a large contributor to the success or the income of sheet 2, because what came up when you roast coal like that, you drive out all the hydrocarbons, and which you add, and then most of that was tar and toluene and benzene and all these products, and it was all separated in Struthers plant, mostly into tank cars, and they sold them. You know, it was called chemical byproducts. So it was a good way not to exhaust all that into the atmosphere, but collect it, solidify it, or change any gas to that, and then ship it. And fertilizer too. It was
one of the early stimuli to capturing those byproducts was during the First World War, when toluol and other potential explosive materials were needed on the Western Front. So we have a variety of steps in the production process in an integrated steel mill. These are the blast furnaces at Duquesne, another U.S. steel plant, and the first to use mechanical charging on the principle of the skip incline in order to replace the top fillers who rolled with wheelbarrows up in an elevator and then dump the raw materials into the open top of the furnace itself. But modernization doesn't necessarily mean success. This is a DOF, basic oxygen furnace shop, also at Duquesne. The steelmaking technique that basically replaced the open hearth did not prevent Duquesne from being shut down.
That was all from scrap, though, charge.
Well, they
You
got
don't produce from iron ore, you throw BOF.
no, but they used molten pig iron from furnaces like Dorothy says.
Okay.
Yeah. So questions. Why did some plants get shut down and others stay open? Well, this is a question that we still have today.
Politics.
Well, what sort of politics?
Well, who's getting?
Who gives you the best deal on environmental regulations?
Taxes and stuff. Yeah.
What governments subsidize the steelmaking process?
Wow, such a cynical view of history. So here is the Rivers of Steel Heritage Area. Geographically, voluminous. This is about as far up the Monongahela River, or as you want to go. This is at Menneson, at the former plant of Pittsburgh Steel, with its coke plant still in operation. You can see the discharge from the waste heat stack if we didn't have that thing up there that says talking to Jessica Wire. Another plant at Hazelwood, also a coke plant. Barges downriver from mines further upstream. Steam from quenching a coke car. So this is the predecessor to this whole debate about Pittsburgh versus Johnstown versus what sort of memory is the federal government willing to invest in regarding the steel industry. Well, they had made an investment in the history of the textile industry by going into Lowell. They went largely into Lowell because there was at that time a U.S. Senator by the name of Paul Saugus who was able to work the political process to get his hometown designated as essentially the national symbol of the textile industry, even though it did not necessarily have the best collection of surviving resources or the most typical story. But Lowell basically became the ideal. The ideal basically was, let's get the National Park Service involved in a series of sites that will commemorate America's industrial revolution at a time of America's industrial shutdown. While still not excluding the opportunities for relatively inexpensive commemorations related to recreational opportunities, such as the many abandoned rail lines that crisscross significant portions of the East and the Midwest. Now, Youngstown has its own history and its own story, and other speakers in this series will be addressing those particular issues. So the question of whether or not the Jeanette blast furnace at Sheepshead's Fire Hill Works should have been preserved as Youngstown's symbol of industrialization, rather than a new build facility like this. You'll hear about that at a later lecture. But eventually, thanks considerably to the influence of we wound up with a facility that is different from anything that we have talked about before. So we're not talking about a site in a heritage area, not yet. We're not talking about a National Park Service site. We're talking about one of a variety of sites in a statewide historical agency, which basically means that the resources available for a facility like this are dependent on the priorities of that state agency and the funds that it has at its particular disposal. It was, in terms of an immediately realizable goal, rather than waiting for the National Park Service to figure out, oh, what are we going to do? That I think.
Make a report.
Well, and frankly, I would have been happy if they'd hired me for the next 20 years to write reports like that. That was the business that we were in. But this particular facility opened and was operating while many of those other debates and other communities affected by the steel industry were still in a process of formulation. Now, it would not, I think, be impolitic to point out that while the Ohio Historical Society showed commendable initiative in creating this facility, they have not shown comparable energy and commitment to its continued operation. We have out on the lawn possibly the only surviving part of an open hearth furnace that is left in the United States. It serves largely as the backdrop to a work of art,
Yes.
the George Siegel sculptures. But the backdrop is, I think, something that is also important. Makes you wonder if it wouldn't perhaps be better if the Ohio Historical Society were willing to underwrite a redesign of the exhibits in this building, which have not changed since the 30 years ago anniversary that we are now celebrating as part of this lecture series. That perhaps there might not be room to have not only the Siegel sculpture, but a more expanded interpretation of the process of what those two figures are doing somewhere in this facility as well. The original exhibits are fine, but it's been a while.
That is tremendous. You know, 3 summers I worked in the steel mill during the 13-week vacation for organization. From Youngstown State, I lived there. But anyhow, that is like it was. When I first walked in there, I saw all the clothes up in baskets up to the ceiling. But then from there, I read the signs why they did it in that. That was so that they would dry and they were safe. And everyone had a lock and on a chain. And you unlocked it with your key, and you brought your bag down, and you got your clothes, put your good clothes in there, put it back up, and you took a shower before you went out. So you're working 3 to 11, you wanted to go out on the town, got all dressed up, showered, walked out, and do bed.
It's a zone of transition. It's between home and work, or work and home, whichever way you're moving, depending on whether your shift is beginning or ending.
Yeah.
But this is part of what people who went into those workplaces every day experience. But there are other parts and other stories as well. A good bit of that equipment came from the McDonald's. And we don't necessarily keep track of some of the things that we do collect. So I was told that this model of a hand sheet mill, the predecessor for the continuous wide hot strip mill, when I took this slide, it was on display in the basement of the Edwards House of the Trumbull Historical Society. They don't seem to be able to relocate. That would be something that I would like to find a use for, because hand sheet rolling was an important carryover from the type of workforce that we saw in the later iron mills and early steel mills into an era where hand skill and physical endurance were less important in terms of employee characteristics. So, where are we? We are at a beginning, and I would like to think we are at a new beginning. 30 years it is a good point to reflect on what has happened here, and a good point to think about what might happen in the next phase of the history of this institution. And I hope with the assistance and contributions of people such as yourselves, that we will be able to begin to take those new steps along that road. So I thank you for your attention, and look forward again to seeing you on many occasions back here as well.
Did Youngstown only make cannonballs like that Bruce Springsteen song?
Yes.
Yes, but I don't believe the furnace that he's referring to in that song ever made cannonballs.
Well, you know a good one too, that Steeltown 1944, that's excellent. I think 10-15 minute thing the government made for the war effort.
Oh yeah, so
We have a copy of that. There's also some footage from the 1920s of the sheet and tube thing.
That would be good to see that.
Some of its own operations.
Is that upstairs in the archives?
Martha B, question?
Yes, it should be available upstairs as well, and we had it playing here in the lobby one time, but that's not my remote control, so I'm not gonna try to do it right now. But yes, it is, and I believe somebody did get it on YouTube. You can go online. The name of it is Steeltown.
Yeah.
So if you do a little bit of, searching on YouTube, I think you can find it.
World Revolution.
Yeah. Please feel free to help yourself to something to drink or a cookie to lunch and ask us more questions or,
That's all the questions we have.
Mama, you retiring from teaching? He's retired.
That's a